preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
It is my intention during the last few weeks that we have left together until the week before Pesach to devote some particular attention now to the thinking of those Jewish religious leaders who have been concerned with attempting to answer in rather detailed and specific terms the question about what does it mean to be a Jew in our day. In other words, there are a number of persons whom we would have to call theologians or philosophers, for want of a better term, who have taken up the religious answer, who say that to be a Jew in contemporary society means largely to be a religious person, a person recognizable in the same way that one recognizes a Catholic or a Protestant or a Muslim. But each of them has tried to explain this in some detail. Since we live in the American Jewish community, and since a good many of us are likely to live here, it is these religious answers which are far more likely to concern us and to be involved in our own lives than any other possible answer which might be given. We shall pay some attention yet to Zionism and what it has to say. But as we shall say, I think when we get to Ben Gurion, the obvious thing to do if one of us is a Zionist is to go to the state of Israel. And since most of you, I should imagine, are probably not willing to go to the state of Israel, or at least for the moment aren't, for which reason we hope you will be back next week, I shall therefore concentrate on the religious answers. Now, why is it that we can't simply take the religious answers for granted? Why is it that we have to take the time and the trouble to explain what a good number of thinkers have had to say about the Jewish religion, as to what it means and what it stands for and why it's important in our day? Why isn't it just simply a rather self-evident thing that just as Jews in previous generations lived under the law and followed the commandments and prayed to their God, so the Jews in our own day would do the same thing? Why should one require philosophy and theology? It is not just the social and political position of the Jew which has changed. It is not just that society has forced us to think about ourselves by virtue of our new social status. But you see, even those things which Jews used to believe easily and simply and naturally have been changed by the intellectual world in which the Jew has found himself. You may recall, I think, that when we spoke of Moses Mendelssohn, we spoke of Moses Mendelssohn not only as a great literary figure, and not only as one who had the opportunity to mix and mingle with Germans in every level, not only one who was a specialist in literary criticism and in aesthetic judgment. He was a philosopher of Judaism. He had to explain what it meant to be a Jew in his day. And the reason for that is that the intellectual standards and criteria which existed inside the ghetto, again to use that phrase in the very broad sense that I have used it, in the medieval Jewish life, did not exist on the outside. The Jew who in the 19th century emerged into the world around him came into a world in which Galileo and Newton were already old figures. It was a world of modern science, a world of modern philosophy. It was a world, as we shall see in a moment, which was to be affected very largely by the work of such thinkers as Kant and Hegel, who made the old ways of thinking about God no longer quite tenable. So this is the new problem which we face. It's one thing to say that to be a Jew in modern times is quite a simple thing. It's to be a religious man by Jewish standards. And since people are, in a modern democratic society, allowed to have a religion of their own, therefore some people are Christians, and we have a few people who are interested in the Baha'i faith, and a very small number in the United States who are interested in being Muslims, and there are a few others who also want to be Jews. But it's one thing to say that they want to be Jews, and another thing for them to really believe in it. And this is the problem. Whereas one may say, oh yes, we are Jews by religion, the problem is, how does the Jew get to be religious? You can't very well have a religion existing if you don't have people who are willing to be religious about it. And this becomes the key problem of modern time. What does it mean to be religious for a Jew today? Or to separate it into two specific questions, which I think lie at the heart of our inquiry over these next few weeks. The first question is the question of believing in God. Is it possible for a modern man to believe in God? And the second question is the question, well, maybe I believe in God. Maybe I am a religious man by this so-called standard. But am I a Jew? Should I be Jewishly religious? I'm willing to believe in God, but lots of people believe in God. I'm even willing to be ethical, maybe, because lots of people are willing to be ethical. But what is there about my believing which is Jewish? Or again, to put it in another way, what is there about my religious believing which makes it important for me to bear the status of a Jew? To be a minority, to be subject to the penalties and difficulties and oppression which the Jewish people has had to face and may have to face again. Is there something about my religious belief which makes it desirable or worthwhile or significant for me to maintain this identity, rather than to take on some other kind of religious identity in which I wouldn't have the tsaros? What is it that I believe that makes it worthwhile to bear the tsaros? This is the second question. Now, the bases for the two questions, I think, are quite clear. The basis for the first question about believing in God, as to whether a modern man can be religious, we have already seen in relationship to Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, religion was a sign of reaction. If one was truly a socialist, and one used a Marxian analysis of society, one saw religion for a tool of the capitalist classes, of the possessing groups, who used it to exploit the masses, who kept them quiet and peaceful and let them hope for something in another world because they weren't going to give them anything in this world. Religion was the tool of reaction. So that from a social analysis, it was hard to be religious. And then there was the scientific problem. Here was religion tied to a Bible in the Western religions, which said something about creation in 7 days and talked about floods spreading over the world at a given time, and had the Red Sea opening up with all kinds of miracles and all sorts of a description of natural phenomena which no modern scientific man could believe. And finally, there were the simple philosophical problems that no one could any longer prove the existence of God. That after the time of Kant, it became fairly clear that proof, rigorous intellectual proof, which demonstrated to anyone who thought straight that there was a God, this too was gone. And on a purely social basis, people might talk about being religious, but no one really began to take religion very seriously. It's not so long ago, I think, that most of us were mixing with people who would say that if anyone was religious, it was rather out of date, wasn't sophisticated, wasn't urbane. And today, there's no easier way to shock one of your friends who may have suddenly started going to a synagogue or become involved in some affair at a synagogue than to look him straight in the eye and say to him, "Harry, have you become religious?" And the poor fellow will drop dead on the spot. He will stammer and he will stutter, and even if he has, he won't admit it. This is a vestige of the old days in which being religious, having some kind of a real belief in God and living by it, had become out of date. I shall perhaps have a chance to refer to this again and again. So that there were many reasons which give rise to the question, in the first place, if a Jew is going to be a Jew by religion, is it possible for him to be religious? And in the second place, so suppose he's religious. There are Unitarians, they're religious, they believe in one God, and they're rather ethical. There are the Quakers who have, in some ways, an even more exemplary attitude toward social problems and the way in which a man ought to live out his religion than modern Jews. There are all kinds of interesting groups around that one might get tied up with. Why a Jew? And what is there Jewish about your belief? And what makes it worth the while of putting up with what we've had to put up with? After all, Not everyone who came out of a German concentration camp remained a Jew. Many of them said, after what I have been through, my children are never going to have to go through this, or my grandchildren, or my great-grandchildren. I will take upon myself the sacrifice of not becoming a Jew. It will be hard for me, but it will be better for my children and my children's children eventually. It may take us a generation or two to assimilate, but I'm going to do it. I don't want anyone to have to put up with this kind of thing again in my family. Well, if you're going to be a Jew by religion, you take upon yourself the burden that this mass of hatred, or if that's too strong a word for our relatively civilized society, although remember the shudders you probably had a few weeks ago when the swastikas began to break out. In our relatively civilized society, if that's too strong a word, let's say the antipathy, the burden. It's a problem being a Jew. Now, why take on that problem? These are the two key questions which I shall be trying to pursue for you during the next few weeks. And in the course of pursuing these, I hope that it will be possible to give you some of the tentative answers which have been advanced by Jews in our own day, as I think these questions lie at the heart of the problems that most American Jews have in accepting some kind of identity as a Jew by religion. Now, in order to start this, we must shift back from the American scene where, at the conclusion of last week's lecture, we have safely seen two liberal movements installed. I wish it were possible for me to give a lecture on early orthodoxy in the United States, but unfortunately, I felt I couldn't find one good, strong Orthodox leader on whom to lay my hands who could be representative of that earlier Orthodox tradition. I shall have a chance to say a word about the later developments of Orthodoxy as we come toward the contemporary key figures. We leave the United States now for a moment with its institutional framework, with its growing Jewish community at the time when the new United States racial immigration laws are applied, when immigration slows now to a very small trickle, with the Jewish community now rather large, of several millions in size, with two liberal movements, the Reform and the Conservative, with a rather inchoate and disorganized Orthodox group, and we shall return to it again. Because it was not here that the primary answers to the question of Jewish religious identity were worked out. Perhaps it is that Americans have been notoriously unphilosophical. Some might even go so far as to say anti-philosophical. The most natural thing for Americans to do when they get together is to discuss technique. How do you organize the religious school, and how do you raise the money for the temple, and how do you see to it that people come to services? The same kind of discussion, if held in Europe, would tend to be metaphysical and philosophical. It's almost as if it's a little too dirty to sully one's hands with such practical matters before one has launched into a philosophical analysis of the situation of contemporary Jewry and what its solution would be. It took a long time for the Americans to get around to having their own thinkers, and as you shall see, there are only a few who can be mentioned by name, even after we get to the very end of the course. Now, the logical place to turn to this is Germany. In the first place, Germany was the country in which the Jews received their emancipation first. Therefore, they had a head start in thinking out the problems of what it meant to be a religious man and a Jew in our day. In the second place, all during the 19th century, and perhaps even into the 20th century, Germany was the leader in intellectual philosophy. I mean by that, the great academicians of philosophy were the teachers of Germany. And the German idealistic school, from Kant through Hegel at least, has been the dominating, if not the dominant, school in philosophy in the 19th century. Therefore, it was quite logical that in Germany, where people were beginning to think in this abstract and logical way, and where Jews were already part of the society, that the first attempts should be made to try to think through these questions of religion. Now, the early attempts, almost all of those that were made in the 19th century, have one characteristic in common. They all tried to take what was the reigning German philosophy and show that this philosophy was really fulfilled in Judaism. Whatever the truth was that philosophy showed, and that seemed to be sweeping the day, this was only a restatement of what Judaism was. Now, as a matter of fact, it happens that both Kant and Hegel, the two great figures of this period, spoke in terms of spirit as contrasted to matter, in terms of absolutes, in terms of something which was unbounded, not finite, and something, therefore, which was very congenial to the Jewish notion of God. I just want to mention to you, not because you may ever hear their names again, some of the men who are part of this succession of German Jewish philosophy, which leads up to the most representative figure of this period, although he is a 20th century Jewish thinker and rabbi, namely Leo Baeck. Now, Leo Baeck, I think, is not quite understandable unless you see him as the product of a whole group of men who came before him. Now, one of the earliest figures, not the earliest, but one of the earliest figures, was a man who tried to take Immanuel Kant's philosophy and use Kant's philosophy as a means of explaining what it was to be a Jew. A doctor, a physician by profession, named Steinheim, tried to write what was going to be a 4-volume exposition of the Jewish religious faith in terms of what Kant had said truth was. Now, for Kant, very briefly, the one source of certainty was man's moral and ethical impulse. The notion that he must do this. This was the one major source of spiritual truth open to man. And while through this one couldn't prove that there was a God, in fact, Kant was the famous destroyer of all the old proofs for the existence of God, Kant said that, look, if you have this as a primary data of your life, that you are commanded to do, that a moral obligation is placed upon you which is unconditional, you must do this, then it's only logical to think that the world is set up in such a way that that command which is given to you can be fulfilled. One is led to believe in a God, although you can't prove him. If you're at all rational and you use your mind in rather logical patterns, it's only logical to believe that there's something in the universe which will see to it that this whole pattern of morality, which you can know and which you do know, that this pattern can be fulfilled. Now, Steinheim took this, and he tried to take this whole notion of the primacy of ethics and the primacy of spirit, and to interpret Judaism in just this way. Judaism was, after all, essentially an ethical religion. If we take a look at the Jewish law and the prophetic writings, one begins to see a tremendous emphasis in Judaism in this regard. Now, it's fairly obvious that if you follow along this way, there is a tendency to kind of slough off some of the ceremonial and ritual observances, particularly the ones which don't quite make sense on first blush, such as, for example, perhaps the most famous example, the law which says quite flatly, you may not wear a garment of mixed stuff if it's half linen and half cotton or a blend of this kind. If you even use linen thread with which to sew a woolen garment, that's treif. It is ritually unfit. Now, there's no reason for that. No one's ever been able to think up a good reason for it. It's just a law, and it's in the Torah, and it's clear, and it's unmistakable. Now then, Steinheim could very easily come out in favor of the moral and the ethical commandments. But he already began the process of trying to find a way to explain some of the ritual commandments. But he couldn't do away with Mount Sinai. When he got to the point of getting to Mount Sinai, he felt this couldn't be done away with. And the Torah, which was given at Sinai, even though he couldn't explain it, even though it was philosophically, what shall I say, unexpected, it was a kind of a miracle. Steinheim only got so far as to indicate that there are certain religious elements about Judaism, although a lot of it is philosophically explicable in terms of Kant. There were two great interpreters of Hegel in the middle and late 19th century, and these were two leaders, one of whom was a leader of Reform Judaism at the time he wrote, and the other became another Reform Jew, a gentleman named Stettner, and another one named Samuel Hirsch, not Samson Raphael Hirsch now, but another Samuel Hirsch. And each of them picked up another point of view, and this was the point of view of Hegel. Now, Hegel had an unusual contribution to make to philosophy. Hegel said, the big mistake we make about the world is taking the stuff around us as real. It's not, really. The only thing that's real is what lies underneath and behind all of this. And what is that? That's really spirit. Now, not some kind of ghost, but in this German sense now of everything intellectual and sensitive and aesthetic and ethical and moral of the human being. In this sense, it is spirit which lies behind the world. And more than that, Hegel wasn't just content with some kind of a flat statement about what lay under the world. He said this thing moves through history. Now that was unusual in philosophy. No one had ever said before that this kind of spirit was involved in history. Time had practically always been left out of philosophy, and nothing in philosophy ever moved along. Of course, that was the trouble. Then you got to history, and history was moving along and bouncing along rather badly. You didn't understand it. Aha, said Hegel. This is what happens. Spirit moves through history in a very interesting and unusual way. First it moves in one direction, and then it creates the seeds of its own destruction. Tyranny gives rise to anarchy and rebellion, and this then will give rise to another stage of oligarchy, which will in turn destroy itself through democracy, which will then become something else, and we wind along a way of thesis and antithesis and synthesis, all working its way up until, as you have probably realized by now, Marx borrowed this kind of thing, until it finally works its way up and spirit makes itself felt in a universal way through history, in a realm of reason and intelligence and logic. Now, religion is one way of expressing this kind of thing. Until people were able to think this, religion was all right. But now that you're able to think it by yourself, you don't really need religion. Although if you want religion, religion is a kind of a wonderful way of expressing the same thing. Now again, one has a kind of doctrine which isn't really strange to Judaism. Because after all, what does Judaism say about history? History is not an entity of itself. From the Jewish point of view, history is the place where God makes himself felt. Remember, the Bible isn't a book of metaphysics. It's not a book of principles of one kind or another. What does the Bible do? It starts with Adam, and then Cain, and then works its way down to the generations of Noah, and then the generations of Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the rest. It's a book of history. And why is it concerned with history? Because God makes himself felt. He talks to people, he tells them. And he's not satisfied with the way they behave in the desert. He wants to take them to a land to live. And after they live on the land, he establishes a kingdom. And after the kingdom is established, he divides the kingdom. And after the kingdoms are divided, he takes the Jews into exile. And after they're in exile, he brings them back. It's not very difficult, is it, to take the entire Jewish conception of history as being the place in which God makes himself felt or acts, and interpreting this in Hegelian phrases, particularly since Hegel is talking about God as absolute spirit. Well, if God is absolute spirit, then you can't make a picture of him. You can't solidify him. You can't make an idol of him, because he's absolute and he's spiritual. And what could be more congenial to a Jew who is looking for an excuse to explain Judaism? So that Stettner and Samuel Hirsch were able to say, the man's already come along and said what Judaism is all along. Yes, he may explain it in a rational way, but this is what Judaism is. Judaism is the religion of the absolute spirit. And whether Brother Hegel understands it or not, we've had this truth all the time. Now, you may recall Nachman Krochmal said something of this kind before, and Krochmal had tried in his own way to give a philosophy of Jewish history as a kind of a Hegelian explanation. Now, I wish the last man whom I want to say a word about were available in English, because he is obviously the great unknown of the German philosophers and perhaps might have more to say to us than any of them. His name is Hermann Cohen. After Hegel had conquered all the great German universities and Kant had become practically forgotten, it was Hermann Cohen who came along and at the University of Marburg helped revive Kant and tried to take on some of the problems in Kantian philosophy and solve them in such a way as to make Kant once again an active and important factor in German philosophical thinking. But Hermann Cohen was a Jew. Now, very often this doesn't disturb professors, that they are born Jewish, and they manage to carry on in their intellectual disciplines without giving any thought to their Jewishness. But Hermann Cohen, the more he went along, the more he began to realize that the philosophy that he was adumbrating had a very close relationship to the Judaism which he had learned as a child. And so very early in his career, he found it necessary to start thinking about what the Jewish religion was in relationship to the philosophy that he had tried to clarify. And he found some astonishing relationships. He finally wrote this out in a rather significant work which has not been translated into English, called The Religion of Pure Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism. Now notice the title. It's a very characteristic title. The Religion of Reason, not pure reason, that's Kant. The Religion of Reason. It's a religion which is founded upon philosophy. Philosophy clarifies and sets forth what religion is or ought to be. Out of the sources of Judaism. One could find in Judaism great numbers of sources which would indicate that this ought to be just the kind of religion that there should be. And from his point of view, Judaism was particularly able to serve as the basis for such a religion of reason. But notice it's a philosopher's formulation. All during his life, Hermann Cohen seemed to move closer and closer to Judaism, and after he had retired from the University of Marburg, he even taught in one of the great German rabbinical schools. Unfortunately, there's very little material on Cohen in English, and what there is so muddy and unclear that we are really in need of some intelligent English interpretation of Cohen. One young German, now American Jewish scholar is at work on such a book, and in a couple of years I hope we have one. I hope, too, it has the kind of effect that Glotzer's book on Rosenzweig, about whom I shall speak next week, had upon the American Jewish community. Here was a figure who was almost totally unknown. But when the book on Rosenzweig appeared, all of a sudden it had a kind of an impact that perhaps it was the community was ready for it, perhaps it was the book. We don't know Cohen. In brief, Cohen's position is a Kantian position. That is to say, it sees in the idea of unity, to which I'm going to return very shortly, as I'm going to do many of the themes here. It sees in the idea of unity the key idea behind science and behind ethics. And it therefore inquires how it is possible to have an ethical world without at the same time unifying it with a natural world. I mean, you have the feeling that you ought to be ethical. But supposing the other people aren't real, supposing nothing is real, it's all a dream of your head, supposing you can't philosophically determine that it's real, which, according to the Kantian problem, you couldn't do. You could guess that it was there, you could feel it was there, but that didn't prove it. It was evidence, but it wasn't proof. Now, how could you really know that the world was there so that the ethics that you were bothering carried out was worthwhile? Well, the logical answer seemed to be very clearly. If you're going to say that ethics is the basis upon which you build up your reality, if that's the most real thing, then the logical thing is to assume that the world is real. Because how could ethics be real unless people were real, unless there were a chance to act it out? And how could there be a bond between the world and you unless there were something which ordered it and set it up and made sure that your ethics had something to do with that world? I mean, you might be getting messages from another planet and wasting your whole life trying not to steal and not to murder and not to commit adultery, when, as a matter of fact, those messages had nothing to do with the world around you. You have to have the feeling that your ethics are really related to that world. Thus, there has to be something which unifies the natural and the physical world with your world of ethics. There has to be something that guarantees that your ethical sensations and feelings and intuitions really apply to the world, and that they won't change in 10 minutes or an hour or a year or 10 years. Now, this unifying principle, which we require whenever we deal with the natural world, and which we require whenever we deal with the moral world, we require when we deal with both worlds together and with the universe as a whole. Now, this kind of thing, which one cannot prove philosophically, but which, if one comes to some understanding of unity, one requires, this becomes the basis for a religion of reason. And again, what is this but Judaism? The religion which emphasizes ethics to such an extent, the religion which says that the God who gives ethics is also the creator of the world, who not only creates it, but who sees that it is good, indeed, tov me'od, very good. The same God who gives the law has a right to give the law because he is the creator. You recall Rashi's comment, why does the Bible begin with the creation? Really should it begin with the laws of Pesach? We might as well get down to the way a Jew ought to live. No. You have to show who you are first before you have a right to give the law. The Torah is set up. It is because God is the creator that he has the right to give the law. There are lots of sources in the Jewish religion to establish a religion of reason. Now, I leave you with this tantalizing note. If Hermann Cohen were available in English, it might be more profitable to speak of him. But he hasn't had the influence on the American Jew that he probably ought to have, largely because he has failed of interpreters. And that's a particularly good word. By interpreters, I mean translators and communicators at the same time. When Cohen finally becomes available, even though he's a rationalist, we may be ready for a little more rational thinking about the Jewish religion. At the moment, in my opinion, the existential interpreters of the Jewish religion have something of an edge in the Jewish field, and maybe a little rationalism such as that by Hermann Cohen will restore the balance. At any rate, I hope so, but we shall have to wait for that. Now, the man who has had a far greater effect has been Leo Baeck, because he has been available in English, and he has had a certain kind of effect. But before I pass to him, I want to indicate why I group these men together and why I put Baeck in a different position. In a way, each of these men has tried to justify Judaism by an outside standard. It's not that Judaism has any particular truth. It's not that Judaism knows anything particularly. It just so happens that our group has had a religion which in large part agrees with what the philosophers have said, and if what the philosophers have said are true, you see, we are also true. Now, most of the men of whom I am speaking have been liberals. They've been willing to slough off and give up certain things in the Jewish religion. But they also have been then in a difficult position of saying, well, why should we be Jews? Maybe what we ought to do is say, all right, so we were Jews before we understood philosophy, but now that we know philosophy, now that we know Kant, and now that we know Hegel, so that there are interesting Jewish sources about this, but why bother? All right, we'll believe in God. You see, we can be religious now in these Kantian or Hegelian forms. But why Jewish? The great problem with all these men, and the problem with Cohen, was that they could never answer the second question. The only reason they were able to answer the first question about the existence of God was that insofar as a loophole for religion was left in the current philosophy, they took it up. But because they were justifying themselves by something outside of Judaism, there was never a justification for being a Jew. That is why I separate Baeck from these men. Because this is not what Baeck did. Baeck did not go to Kant or go to Hegel or to anyone else, find his standard of truth there, and say, you see, that's what Judaism is. It will be almost immediately apparent to you as I begin to talk about Baeck that he has learned a great deal from Kant and of Hegel and lives in a world in which these philosophers are quite common. But I think as you see the formulation, you will see where Baeck rises to an entirely different level, where he is in another world. Now, the astonishing thing about Leo Baeck is that he came to fame very quickly, stayed there very long, and although his greatest work was done when he was a young man in his 20s, the very end of his life, which seemed almost to be an anticlimax to what he had done, turned out to be the fulfillment and the climax of everything that went before. Occasionally, I believe you have heard the Protestant notion and occasionally the Catholic notion that the Jewish religion is a religion of law and of formalism. It's dry, rigid. The Old Testament God is a God of wrath and vengeance. And that it's only with the coming of the New Testament that compassion, that love, that understanding, that forgiveness come into the world of religion. This was the standard cry of the Protestant theologians, and particularly the liberal Protestant theologians, at the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century. A very liberal Christian theologian named Adolf Harnack had written a very famous book called The Essence of Christianity, in which he tried to make perfectly clear that the essence of Christianity was love, was its understanding of the relationship between men, was the famous statement in the Gospel of John that God is love. Now, in order to make this point, he builds up a straw man of what Judaism is. Legality, minutiae of ritual observance, small technical details with regard, for example, to whether or not one may wear garments of mixed stuff. Now, one contrasts that with love of one's neighbor and love of God, and this kind of passionate feeling, and it's quite obvious that in Christianity one has the fulfillment of what was merely incipient in Judaism. A young rabbi of a rather small town, I keep hearing Zazen in my head, but I know that's wrong, where Leo Baeck was rabbi in his 20s, decided that this was utterly ridiculous and needed to be answered. And so he wrote a book, a simple little book which he called The Essence of Judaism. And to this day, it is one of the great modern books on the Jewish religion. If there were 5 books you had to be asked to read to understand contemporary Jewish religious thought, one of them would be The Essence of Judaism. It is still in print in this country. The Schocken Press published it, and a 3rd edition of the English translation recently appeared. It's a difficult book to read, I warn you in advance. The English translation sounds as if it was written in German. And the form and the style of Baeck are very difficult. One chapter will go 180 pages or so. There are not very many chapters then, you understand, but instead of breaking things up into discrete little units, Baeck loved to build up towering fortresses of thought with the most beautiful symmetry piled up. It's a little difficult to read, but it's worth it. It's worth taking 6 months to read the book. No one says you have to finish it. You'll know how it comes out. The conclusion is very simple. Who done it? God. He's responsible, and in the last analysis, Baeck wants you to be a Jew. So don't rush. But you will get a flavor and a spirit of what it means to know the essence of Judaism that's like nothing else. From the day the book appeared, practically, unto the present day, this has been one of the major statements of Jewish religious thought in our time. Very shortly after this, Baeck, who was a liberal rabbi, it's a little difficult to describe quite what German liberalism is. The German liberal congregations were always affiliated with those groups which were in other countries what we would call Reformed. In practice, they tended to be more like American conservative congregations, but in thought, they tended to be more like American Reformed congregations. It's something of an anomaly to us. In the United States, Leo Baeck was always affiliated with the Reformed Jewish groups. He went to Berlin as the chief liberal rabbi shortly after the book was published, and he served there for the rest of his life. He had a very notable career. Among the great things which he did, he was part of what was known as the World Union, is known as the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which brought liberal Jews from Germany and France and Italy and the United States together in an effort to unite their common causes. But while Baeck's career could have ended on that scale, he had the rather unusual position of being chief rabbi of the Berlin liberal Jewish community during the time that Hitler came to power. And when all the Jewish organizations of Germany established a Präsidium which would speak for the entire Jewish people of Germany, Baeck was the chief man of the Präsidium, of 3 men. It was he, Leo Baeck, who represented German Jewry in its hour of greatest crisis. Now that would be just a statistic, a fact, an interesting fact. But during this time, he, primarily he, I think, was able to give a kind of a stature, a kind of a dignity, a kind of, what shall I say, of spiritual quality. The man was a pacifist, I must tell you. In the midst of the Hitler Holocaust that no one could do, he did things that, they sound heroic. If you had seen him, a rather tall, thin, somewhat frail man after the war, it's a little difficult to believe of him to be a hero, but he did things such as this. He personally escorted a group of German children to London in 1938, after the burning of the synagogues when the Nazi terror became rather intense, and he was in London. He was on British soil, and then got back on an airplane and flew back into Berlin. He had an invitation from one of the great Cincinnati Reformed Jewish congregations to come and serve them, that he should be their rabbi. There was no reason that he had to stay in Germany. The United States would arrange to get him out, to get him transportation here, and all the rest. But he refused. He refused to leave. And then, of course, eventually, he, with all the other Jews of Berlin, were taken and placed into concentration camps. And there was another rabbi named Leo Baeck in his concentration camp. For one reason or another, which fate will never know, when they finally got around to issuing the execution orders for what was probably this Rabbi Leo Baeck, the other Rabbi Leo Baeck stepped forward, and the other inmates refused to let this Leo Baeck go forward. And he stayed alive all during the war. He was a man well up into his 60s at that time. He stayed alive, and when the Theresienstadt concentration camp was captured, a special, I believe it was British team, was assigned the job, as they had with all the art relics and the important treasures of the past. A team was assigned to find him, and they found him. And they got him and took him out. And then the stories began to roll on what he'd been doing in the camp. He had been doing all those things that the Germans said that you mustn't do. His point of view was a very simple one. It was the German might do anything they wish to us, but they cannot take away our dignity as human beings. The dignity of a human being is to be found by the fact that he has spirit, that he uses his spirit, his mind, his ability to think and reason. So what did he do? He gave lectures. In the barracks, he conducted a university. Gave lectures not just on Jewish subjects, but remembering the classical Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and the others, by heart in the Greek. He would lecture on them, would lecture on all kinds of subjects. He conducted services. He would be smuggled in from barracks to barracks. He would give personal services to individuals in need of a rabbi. And people told rather miraculous stories about him. I think perhaps the greatest story of all is the one that he himself said quite accidentally one day at breakfast with the lady at whose home he was staying. She was unable to bear the fact that this wonderful giant of an old man had been in a concentration camp, and she said to him, but what did you do all day? And he said, oh, we were all assigned our work in the concentration camp, and I had mine. She said, well, Dr. Baeck, what did you do? He said, oh, well, every morning after we were supposed to go to work, I was hitched to a wagon with another man, and we would pull the wagon around the camp, and the garbage would be collected, and we would haul the garbage through the camp until we would get it to the dumping spot, and then we would dump the garbage and bring the wagon around and continue this all day long until our work was done. She said, Dr. Baeck, you mean you were hitched to a wagon and pulled a wagon through a concentration camp? How horrible! How could they do such a thing to you? And she says, he looked at her with a little bit of surprise in his eye and said to her, why, really, you shouldn't say that. You see, the other horse was a very remarkable fellow, and we had many wonderful conversations. Now, a man who can say a thing like that is a man of extraordinary person. He even started to write a book about which I hope I shall say a word before the end of the evening's lecture. In the concentration camp, he had started to write a book, what is almost certainly the sequel to The Essence of Judaism. And it became 2 volumes. One little volume was published almost immediately after his arrival in England. It was in German. And the second volume was just published about 3, maybe 4 years ago now. There is an effort being made now to translate it, although it's running into some difficulties, but perhaps it will eventually get out. Now that's the man. And in a way, maybe the man is more important than his thought. A man who can live that kind of life. He died in London about 1.5 years ago. A man in his early 80s. He was hit by accident by a bus. A common kind of accident that an older person can sometimes get into because there's a misunderstanding of some kind of traffic signals and the rest. And world Jewry, world liberal Jewry mourned his loss. No German Jew, I think, was untouched by the fact that Leo Baeck had died. Now, what was Leo Baeck's intellectual position? I don't know that it makes much difference after you hear the story of his life. But just briefly to indicate the way in which he went about dealing with the intellectual problem in his various writings, because I'm not just going to give you the essence of Judaism. The thing that mattered to Baeck most was to discuss the Jewish idea of God. He's not much troubled about discussing the existence of God, because Judaism knows that there is a God. If you don't know that there is a God, you have a problem. But this is not a Jewish problem already. This is a problem of being an alien in contemporary civilization. Now, maybe the reason that he doesn't deal with it is because he felt that anybody, by going through the normal Kantian or Hegelian way of understanding society, would know that there was a God. Or maybe it is that he can't really believe that a Jew ever gives up God. He may talk about giving up God, but he really has a God somewhere or another. At least he has some kind of an idea of God, or he has some kind of an idea which, if he were willing to say he was religious, he would know that that was God. And it is therefore this idea of God which concerns Baeck a great deal. And here he again is involved in this whole question of unity and ethics which we have touched before. It was Baeck who took a phrase and made it a household word. Namely, the key to the Jewish notion of God is that it is an ethical monotheism. It's not just a monotheism. You occasionally have a notion of one God in various religions around the world. Nor is it just simply a notion of ethics, that there is a right and wrong that you ought to do. The two are absolutely inextricably linked up in Judaism. In Judaism, the one God is an ethical God, a righteous God, and he is purely one. Now, the two ideas clearly complement one another. If God were really two, there might be two standards of ethics. If God is really one, he ought to stand for one thing and not for several things. If he stands for one, that's good already, because once he stands for one thing, we have some hope of being able to understand it. Fortunately, this one thing which God stands for, as we respond to it, we find to be ethical. Now, from Baeck's point of view, this is the key to the whole Jewish religion. That God is both absolutely one and absolutely ethical at the same time. And this to him is a revolutionary idea. He liked to make the play, which can be translated into English, it was a revolution and therefore a revelation. It is because this idea is so unique, so extraordinary, because it's one, the first one of its kind, this idea of God, it creates a revolution. The minute you start chasing out the small gods, the minute you start recognizing that God is ethical, you have an entirely different relation to human beings and towards society. You might have a God who's ethical, but if he isn't the God who's the entire world, then you're only ethical to your people and you hate everybody else. Oh no. This is one ethical God for the entire world. You have to learn to love everybody. And if he's an ethical God and one God, he's one God all the time. Therefore, you have to be ethical all the time. To say that the God of Israel, the guardian of Israel, doth neither slumber nor sleep means that there is no time when he stops being ethical, and therefore there's no time that you can stop being ethical. And to say that he is primarily a God who is ethical means that he primarily demands action. To know this God is to know that you have to behave in a certain way, that you have to live in relation to your neighbor in your society in such a manner as to maintain this relationship with him. The emphasis is upon action, not so much upon creed, and not so much upon faith, and not so much as upon some inner state, but upon what you do, because that's where ethics counts. It's the act that is meaningful in God's eyes, and the ethical act. Thus, Baeck says that Judaism, by virtue of being the ethical religion, is the kind of religion which really knows and lives with this God. But he avoids the emphasis of being simple about ethics. You know, the great challenge in ethics is not to lay down little laws by which people can follow. You know, you give them a kind of a little intellectual slide rule, and whenever they get into a difficult situation, they take out law 16 with regard to how to answer it, and there's the law, and that's the answer, and there you are. This is what people very often try to do by ethics. Baeck is too much of a Jew for that. He knows that the Torah is not a book of ethical principles. There may be ethical ideas in the Torah, but it's not a set of principles by which you live. It's rather small and stubborn little pieces. Sometimes they seem almost in conflict with one another. Why is that, says Baeck? Because essentially ethics and ethical action is a matter of polarity. There are certain tensions involved which can never be fully resolved. For example, take the tension between justice and mercy. Justice is the essence of ethics. If you don't have justice, how can you say you're ethical? People should get certain things that they are entitled to, and a person ought to get his due. If there's no ought to, there's no ethics. But supposing you tried to create an ethic strictly on the basis of justice, or to make it even worse, supposing God tried to create an ethics strictly of justice with you. Supposing you were really held accountable for everything you did wrong. You'd have no basis upon which to go on. You'd never get square with God, would you? There has to be some kind of forgiveness in the relationship between man and God, and so between man and man. If every man exacted every right that he had against his neighbor who wronged him, now you might enjoy that. But that would mean that your neighbor could exact every wrong you had done to him, intentionally or unintentionally. Because remember, once one gets into the level of intention, one also gets involved into the question of forgiveness and motive and the like. Therefore, you must have forgiveness as well as justice. But suppose you have only forgiveness. Everybody forgives everybody for everything. Then how do you have standards? What's to prevent people from doing something wrong all the time? All right, so you'll forgive me? Do me something. There is a polarity involved. Or take another tension that Baeck liked to talk about, the tension between arrogance and humility. A religious man ought to be humble. He ought to know that he's really nothing. Before God, what are we? But, when I look at the heavens, the work of thy hands, the sun and the moon which thou hast made, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou takest account of him? What are we? And in particular, a world of science. It's not bad enough they have planets and stars. They've got galaxies. And the radio telescopes go out even further than the light telescopes. And what's 1,000 million light years? You're nothing. Evolutionary, you're a kind of a chunk off the organic tree. Nothing. But supposing we stopped there. So we wouldn't want to do anything, we wouldn't want to be anything, and whatever native ability is contained within us would go absolutely to waste. It's only when you see the vision of yourself as something beyond yourself that you reach forward. And if you see yourself only as a nothing, you would never grow to be godlike. Now supposing you get the vision of being created in the image of God, and you reach forward and you grow and you try to become more and more ethical, then you say, this would be splendid. Then you may commit the other fallacy. And what is the other fallacy? The fallacy of arrogance, which says, it's I who has done this. My power and the might of my hand has gotten me this gain. Don't need God. We can make things, and I have made this money, and I have built this house, and this society was built by man alone. And we don't need God. We rule God out of the universe. Now what happens then? Man begins to think of himself as so supreme, and then gets involved in ruling other men, and there is no one so despicable as a man who thinks he knows absolute right and wrong, and then proceeds to apply it to his fellow man, and as a result to exercise his absolute knowledge against him in oppression and in persecution and the like. So you can't be completely arrogant, because if you are completely arrogant, you begin to not to feel that you stand under judgment too. So what do you have to be? You have to be arrogant enough to say, I can be godlike, and humble enough to be able to remember that you're only a nothing. There aren't any strict, easy laws for being ethical. But where does this ethics come from? It comes out of a living relationship with that God. You can't divorce ethics from God. If your ethics are to be really meaningful, you need both the humility, which comes from knowing there is a God, and the arrogance, which says, I am created but little lower than the angels. You need the notion of justice, which comes from saying there is a God in the universe who has standards, and the love which comes from knowing you are being forgiven. Ethics derives from this. And, says Baeck, this Jewish idea concerning God, and therefore the whole Jewish passion for ethics, is unique in the field of religion. He makes what is perhaps the most forceful and vigorous attack on Christianity known in modern Jewish literature. Most of the time, Jews are busy running around saying how wonderful the Christians are, and how wonderful the Jews are, and how much we have in common, and so on and so forth. Baeck is always very polite. But by the time he's done with Christianity, you're convinced that it is a passive, effeminate, backward religion. That it really doesn't have the vigorous, ethical, forward-looking stamp of Judaism. And the reason it doesn't is because it doesn't have the same real understanding of God that Judaism does. The minute you dilute God from 1 to 3, you're in trouble. And the minute you say that God is to be approached either by faith or sacraments, you dilute the ethical standard of the religion. And while he may somewhat overplay the argument, he treats Judaism and its religious standards and the ethical point of view he's been set forward against the traditional Lutheran position that justification is by faith and by faith alone. You may get to works, but justification is by faith. So what does he say? Christianity comes closest of all the religions, but it doesn't come close at all. Therefore, on rational grounds, on philosophical grounds now, Baeck has demonstrated that the Jewish idea of God is unique. No other religion has it. And we need the Jewish people to preserve, protect, and defend this idea. The Jewish people are the bearers of this precious heritage, of this notion of a unifying God who is ethical and single in the universe, and without them, the idea will disappear. Therefore, Jews are required to keep this idea alive now and to carry this idea through all of history. This is why there needs to be a Jewish people in our own day, and if need be, even to suffer for it. Because what will all of history mean if this idea goes down the drain? What were all the previous efforts of the generations if the ethical and single God is not carried out through history? No, we need to stand up for it. And everything that helps keep a Jew is valuable for this purpose. The ceremonies, they're not central to Judaism. The holidays, the observances, they're not central. They are the means by which we keep the Jewish people true to its religion, and such ceremonies as are outworn or have gone past their time, they can be dispensed with. Baeck was a liberal, as I said to you, and this explains his liberalism. But he said one very wonderful thing, too, which I think I must tell you. He said, you know that for a Jew, even to remain a Jew, just simply to remain a Jew and not become something else, this is a religious duty. Because a Jew stands for something. He stands for this idea of God. And therefore, no matter whether he does something or he doesn't do something about it, as long as he says, I'm a Jew, that in itself is a religious duty. Because it means the world has before it this notion of God as long as those Jews are walking around. It's worth suffering for, and it's obviously worth living by. It's simply worth existing for this idea. Now that was written in 1905. 1905. It's interesting that the book which he wrote after he came out is no longer called The Essence of Judaism. It's called something else. It's called Dieses Volk, this people. No longer essences, philosophical abstractions. This people right here and now. Jiddische Existenz. Jewish existence. The reality of what it means to live as a Jew in the world. I wouldn't say that Baeck had become an existentialist. But the older idealism, the older abstract understanding of what it meant to be a Jew, now had to have another dimension added to it. I can't tell you about that book very much, but I'm glad in a way that next week we will take up Franz Rosenzweig, who reacted almost against the kind of thinking that Baeck had been doing, although not quite, and took us into the area of Jiddische Existenz, what it means to exist as a Jew. And as we go on to some of the other thinkers, we will have the opportunity to catch certain other layers in this presentation. Well, I'm sorry it took me a little longer than I wanted, but it's obviously a fascinating subject. Religion that he understands. It's compulsive. You must do it this way. It's a means of getting rid of your guilt. Well, supposing you get to a man who is a liberal, who doesn't say you have to do it this way. The only problem that's left for him is the question of whether or not the God that he projects into the world is some kind of an illusion, some kind of a father figure. But Baeck felt that maybe one could say this if one dealt with people who were deluded, but he didn't feel deluded. He felt that he was a very, mature and sensible individual, and so had the generations of Jews been throughout history. On this point, if I may, I don't know if this really represents Baeck's point of view at all, I would guess that he would probably feel that if Freud had stayed in his field, he would have been more worth listening to. Maybe it was Freud's own problems with his Jewish religion or his own father that led him to raise certain questions about whether or not there really was a God. For Beck, there was no question.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.